BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And in this episode, I will be discussing the book Jack the Ripper and the East End, looking at a description of the killer, going through the list of suspicious characters, and discussing the film Waxworks from 1924, which may contain an early feature of Jack the Ripper. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and I am your host, Blackbox Ned. Recently on the channel, I've been talking to you guys about a book called Jack the Ripper and the East End, which has a couple introductory segments that were written by Peter Ackroyd, and one of them features a description of the killer. Jack the Ripper, of course, was a serial killer that operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. And I will be looking firstly at the description of the killer for this episode here, and I'm just going to have a very brief read from Peter Ackroyd's writings. In the autumn of 1888, the newspapers began to speculate about the identity of the killer. From witness statements, descriptions were prepared and circulated to police forces, and indirectly to the public through the press. Jack the Ripper's possible age was 37, height 5 feet 7 inches tall, rather dark beard and mustache, dress shirt, dark vest, and trousers, black scarf, black felt hat, spoke with a foreign accent. Now this is something that is going to be very, very contestable. I mean, I have some particular problems with this witness description here, or just this entire composite profile of Jack the Ripper. I'm going to read that for you one more time. Age 37, height 5 feet 7 inches tall, rather dark beard and mustache, dress shirt and dark vest and trousers, black scarf and black felt hat, spoke with a foreign accent. The reason why I have a problem with that is not a universal description. Not everyone who claimed to see a potential Ripper's person of interest or suspect came up with those exact statements. For starters, we have one that is a little bit similar, but not quite on point, and that one comes to us from George Hutchinson, who saw a man walking with Mary Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper, and George Hutchinson saw this on November 9th of 1888, and his statement was somewhat different, although I do confess that Hutchinson actually has things that are almost on point with this. It's just he's looking at someone who's a little bit shorter and a little bit younger, and I'll read that for you right now. George Hutchinson's description: about age 34 or 35, height 5 feet 6 inches tall, complexion pale, dark eyes and eyelashes, slight mustache curled up at each end, and hair dark, very surly looking dress, long coat, collar and cuffs, trimmed astrakhan, and a dark jacket under, light waistcoat and dark trousers, dark hat felt turned down in the middle, button boots with gaiters and white buttons, wore a very thick gold chain, white linen collar, black tie with horseshoe pin, respectable appearance, walked very sharp, Jewish appearance, can be identified. And this became one of the most controversial witness descriptions because some of this stuff is extremely detailed, talking about the horseshoe pin, looking at the color of his button, saying that he's wearing white buttons, seeing the extremely thick gold chain. But I don't know if I'm in the minority here, but one of the reasons why I tend to have doubts about the statement of George Hutchinson is that he said that he could identify the killer. And it's really interesting that there is no reliable composite sketch that was drawn of Jack the Ripper. If someone had such a good look at this potential person of interest that was seen walking with Mary Kelly. And let's say, hypothetically, even if Hutchinson is telling the truth completely, there could be some other explanation going on about how he didn't actually see the killer. This could be a different man walking with Mary Kelly that was simply unidentified, but that requires a few particular assumptions. But as we're going to see in the book, the Jack the Ripper and the East End, there are composite sketches of the Ripper that were drawn. It's just that they are not really seen as reliable. But I'll share those in just a second. However, there are other descriptions of Jack the Ripper that were seen either by witnesses or in the vicinity of where the crimes were seen. Of course, there's the one from Joseph Lavenda, and just to have a quotation here, he saw a man with Catherine Eddowes near the Miller's Court pub on September 30th of 1888, aged about 30, fair complexion and a mustache, a pepper and salt jacket, gray cloth cap, and a matching peak and a reddish neckerchief. Okay, though, so this is quite different. Looking at somebody who is age 37 versus somebody who was age 30. So this is, a 7-year difference. And 7 years of age from these particular age gaps are going to show someone who's 30 years old often will look considerably younger than someone who is 37 years old. But that is just my take on the subject. Yes, I'm fully aware that everyone has some type of differences. Some people look older and some people look younger. And we can even use that as a challenge question. How old do you think that Jack the Ripper was? One person who was trying to make certain estimations about the Ripper was the FBI profiler John Douglas, and his profiling statements have been shared on the Jack the Ripper Tour website, which I'll read here. And I've gone through John Douglas's material in the past. He laid all this out in his book, The Cases That Haunt Us, and I have a direct response to that here on Ripper Wednesday. You can find that under Jack the Ripper, The Cases That Haunt Us. And I also have an episode on his psychological profile, which, again, that's just the title of it. But here is the statement from Jack the Ripper Tour. By 1988, the first ever profile of Jack the Ripper was conducted in America by FBI profilers John Douglas and Roy Hazelwood. Taking the original police reports and medical evidence, they compiled a list of 11 character traits that they believed Jack the Ripper would have had. Jack the Ripper would be a male, between 25 and 35 years old, live locally to the Whitechapel and Spitalfields area, a loner who was more than likely unmarried. As a child, he would have had an absent father and a dominant mother figure, a mental or physical disability or deformity which made him feel different than others, a solitary job which kept him away from social encounters, seen as quiet and timid to those who knew him, and he would be perceived as a little odd. Beneath the surface would lie a deep and resentful aggression which would explode during bouts of low self-esteem, and he would not feel guilt or remorse for his crimes in a way, and he considered them justified. So, now we're going as low as 25 for Jack the Ripper, and it is possible for a 25-year-old to be mistaken for a 37-year-old. But, one of the big problems, though, that I do have with these statements from John Douglas is, this is just the entire concept of a serial killer is a sad, lonely man. And as we all know, serial killers aren't always fitting this description. Look at some of the stuff here, that a loner who was more than likely unmarried. Think about all the possible cases of serial killers where you are dealing with somebody who was married and had children, seen as quiet and timid to those who knew him, and he would be perceived as a little bit odd, working a solitary job. This is just what people used to say about serial killers. Oh, well, he spent all of his time by himself and he had no friends or family. That's the way that people used to portray serial killers. But this profile was made in 1988. And I think we are much more aware now that not all serial killers behave like this or act like this. And you can also, give any feedback you have to this particular description. And you might be thinking, well, Ned, who are you to challenge John Douglas? And I'm fully aware that he knows more than I do. These are just genuine concerns that I have about this particular statement. And also, as somebody who is following the Jack the Ripper case, I don't think that we should be so limited to the point where we're just going to say, nope, we're only looking for a white male, 25 to 35, somebody who was not married, had no kids, no family, and spent all of his time by himself, who didn't even have a father growing up. I do not think that we should be that limited. But I would like to continue with the book Jack the Ripper and the East End right now, because this is a book that I've been talking to you guys about on several different Ripper Wednesdays, and it got my attention because Paul Begg appeared on the Ripper cast, and he said that there was this book out there called Jack the Ripper and the East End, which didn't talk about Jack the Ripper at all. It actually only focuses on the East End of London. So I decided to flip through it for myself, and it appears that there are two sections that do indeed talk about Jack the Ripper, and I'm going to go through one of them for you now, and this one was written by Peter Ackroyd. But some of the other things in this book are talking about the geography of Whitechapel, the women of Whitechapel, and Paul Begg is mostly correct that it heavily focuses on the East End, as opposed to discussing the Ripper crimes, but because the Ripper is the title story, that's what I would like to focus on here, and continuing with something that has been created by Peter Ackroyd, the list of suspicious characters. The police were active in following up leads, but to no avail. One prime suspect emerged as Leather Apron. The Star newspaper revealed that he carried a razor-like knife, threatened to rip up women, and was able to move noiselessly around the streets of Whitechapel and Spitalfields. Named as John Pizer, a Polish Jew and boot finisher, who regularly wore a leather apron and lived in lodging houses in the area. He was held by the police for questioning, but was released when his alibi was established. Now there is a rumor out there. There is a word on the street that someone is going to be exploring new things involving Leather Apron. I'm just going to get to the point. On a recent Zodiac Monday, I had the opportunity to interview Denise Diana Huddle. She is the author of the book Anthrax to Zodiac, as well as the novel Hell to Pay, and she is working on a new book about Jack the Ripper called A Tale of Two Rippers, which is going to talk about Jack the Ripper and a different serial killer called the Midnight Assassin who operated in America from 1884 to 1885, and she wants to re-examine the Leather Apron narrative. In short, she wants to dispute this possibility of John Pizer having an alibi, and I don't want to put words in her mouth and just say that John Pizer is her Jack the Ripper suspect. Instead, I think I did it as fairly as possible when she said that she wants to dispute this alibi. So even though John Pizer has mostly been dismissed as a suspect in the minds of many, he will come back into the foreground. Let's keep going here with Jack the Ripper and the East End. In the search for the killer, the focus of the police and media ranged widely from soldiers to horse slaughterers, from seamen to medical students. Such was the mania that even George R. Sims, the popular writer and journalist, while reporting the story, was mistakenly identified by a coffee stall keeper as the murderer. He bore a resemblance to a mysterious, blood-stained customer on the night of the double murder. Sims, writing many years later, explained that the murderer was undoubtedly a doctor who had been in a lunatic asylum and had developed homicidal mania of a special kind. Wow, I definitely have some problems with that statement, that the Ripper was a doctor who had previously been institutionalized. I'm not completely convinced of that, because I think that I've been influenced by other sources to the point where it seems to me that it's probably the exact opposite. Most people believe the exact opposite. If you want to dispute this with me, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with these Ripper Wednesday segments. But most people seem to think that the Ripper was somebody who was deteriorating, that his mental state was deteriorating, and then he was institutionalized. Not the opposite, not the contrary, not like in this order of, okay, he was a doctor who had been in a mental institution, who had been released, then he commits the crimes. I suppose that anything's possible, but that's very assumptive. And also, you'd have to wonder, why wasn't this guy being supervised? Or just, I think that it's making a certain amount of assumptions. But let's keep going here. Surviving archive reveals that detectives had at least 5 possible suspects, the list of suspicious characters. One was Francis Tumblety, a quack doctor who had a collection of uteri, that's the female uterus. He was arrested for homosexual practices but escaped to the United States while on bail. And I think that one of the most problematic issues with Francis Tumblety is I mean, firstly, when I did my episode about him, I didn't see anything that was immediately Jack the Ripper related, but also, and this might even be more important, I did read once from maybe not the most scholarly of sources that Francis Tumblety was 6 feet tall, and if he were 6 feet tall, I don't think that matches any of the witness descriptions that we've been going through. Okay, 5'5", 5'6", 5'7", that's not 6 feet tall. So if that's correct, then highly improbable. Another one was Montague Druitt, a barrister and schoolmaster who committed suicide not long after Mary Kelly's death. And I have 2 episodes about Montague John Druitt as a Jack the Ripper suspect. I just simply think that he was unfairly vilified. I think he was a troubled individual who passed away shortly after the murder of Mary Kelly, so then people were trying to blame him for the murders because it was convenient. But there is absolutely nothing to me that suggests that Montague John Druitt was homicidal. And somebody asked me, I mean, are you familiar with the book that talks about how there could be the secret confession of Montague John Druitt to a priest? And the answer is yes. And I have discussed it before here on Ripper Wednesday. That book is called Jack the Ripper Case Solved, 1891 by J.J. Hainsworth, and that's the one that is going to explore these theories about how Melville MacNaughton may have even been aware of this possible confession when a priest came forward, and he wrote a story as a piece of fiction because he didn't want to violate the sanctity of the confessional. But yes, it's possible that Montague John Druitt said that. Okay, so the book claims. But I've told you very clearly that Montague John Druitt is not my top suspect. And next, we have someone who perhaps could be a very viable top suspect, and his name is Aaron Kosminski, a Jewish barber who had a great hatred of women and strong homicidal tendencies. Then, I mean, with Aaron Kosminski, though, let's not kid ourselves. Aaron Kosminski could have been Jack the Ripper, or he could be somebody who was also a fall guy, who was also being blamed for this. And one of the things, though, is that I cannot think of a single instance where Kosminski actually killed anybody. He could be somebody who had homicidal tendencies that was able to just hide it from everyone. But, John Douglas said that he thought that Jack the Ripper was 25 to 35. That provides a median age of 30. Aaron Kosminski was 23 years old. Yet, at the same time, John Douglas says that his suspect was Kosminski. How on earth does that work out? But if we're going to talk about suspects who are convicted murderers, we have George Chapman, who was also known as Severin Klasovsky. Again, he was another East European who came to London, changed his name to George Chapman, and he was hanged in 1905 for the Borough poisoning murders. And there's a book out there by R. Michael Gordon called The Thames Torso Killer of Victorian London, if I've got that right. Excuse me if I got some words jumbled there. But R. Michael Gordon has his book out where he claims that Severin Klasovsky was Jack the Ripper, the Thames Torso Killer, and the Borough Poisoner. And ultimately, it's a very wild and loaded theory. You'd have to be accepting certain assumptions, and you'd have to accept that certain details would be all just falling in place perfectly for that particular theory to work. But I think that the more widely discussed theory is just that Severin Klasovsky was Jack the Ripper, and then he went on to murder his wives, so he became the Borough Poisoner, which he was ultimately hanged for. See, that's why he would have to be a mid-level suspect. I mean, with Aaron Kosminski, I do give some credit to the members of law enforcement who suspected him, and I don't do that in all the cases that I follow. I also talk about the Zodiac Killer, D.B. Cooper, and the Black Dahlia here on Black Box Online Radio. I don't do that with all the cases. In fact, in the Zodiac Killer mystery, I mostly dismiss the opinions of law enforcement because I've spent enough time with that case where I can tell you where this person is wrong, why this person is wrong, the holes in their theories, the holes in their observations. Maybe one day I'll be able to do that with Jack the Ripper. But there's another person on this list of suspicious characters made by Peter Ackroyd, and that is, another suspect was Michael Ostrog, a Russian doctor and convict who was subsequently detained in a lunatic asylum as a homicidal maniac. And ultimately, it seems like Michael Ostrog was incarcerated in France at the time. He could not have been Jack the Ripper. And another version maintains that Sir William Gohl, a Freemason, was the killer acting on behalf of senior government figures and members of the royal family to cover up for the prince's indiscretions, that the killings were part of an elaborate Masonic ritual, and this would become the foundation of the book by Stephen Knight, The Final Solution, where he's more or less talking about the Masonic conspiracy and the royal conspiracy. And one thing that I think is really interesting about this is that people are either on board with that or they're not. They're either saying that, oh yeah, that's what a really good set of observations, or they are saying that nope, it's completely wrong, zero, it's just a wild conspiracy theory with no merit. And it's a very, very polarizing set of events. But I would just like to ask you guys, would you like to hear a Ripper Wednesday about the book The Final Solution? That's one that I've never talked about before, and I think that is somewhat different than these other Jack the Ripper related conspiracies, because one thing that you guys are very divided on is doing a book discussion in the future on Jack the Ripper and the black magic rituals. Again, some people are just like, okay, I'm curious about that, and other people are like, no, absolutely not, it's a total waste of time. And I think with Stephen Knight and The Final Solution, people are experiencing some similar observations. So I would like to continue with the writings of Peter Ackroyd here, where he's talking about the taint of poverty. This is moving on from the suspect list. The taint of poverty, already evident in the medieval period, was memorialized by John Stowe in his book The Survey of London. He observed that in the east of London there was a continual street of filthy straight passage, with alleys or tenements or cottages, but almost to Ratcliffe. Ratcliffe is now part of the borough of Stepney, and by the end of the 16th century the whole area was being described as base and filthy. In 1665, Spitalfields, the neighborhood of the first and last murders by Jack the Ripper, was reported to be inhabited by the poor and idle and loose persons. Such were the persons, of course, who were murdered 2 centuries later. The small industries of the neighborhood were filthy too, banished from the rest of London. In the early 1660s, Sir William Petty, an economist and statistician, lamented that the fumes and steams and stinks of the whole easterly pile were present. Okay, and one more time, these are the writings of Peter Ackroyd from the book Jack the Ripper and the East End. And I do have one final thing to share with you guys about this book here, and that is that Jack the Ripper and the East End talks about a film from 1924 called Waxworks that features an early depiction of Jack the Ripper. It's widely regarded that the first film that was made about Jack the Ripper was in 1927 by Alfred Hitchcock, called The Lodger, although The Lodger is based on a novel, and the killer in that story is not named the Ripper, he's named the Avenger, but it's still an amazing movie. I love silent films, and that is one that I was definitely impressed with. But the film Waxworks from 1924 is available on YouTube. You can watch it for free, and I did because I wanted to see how they were going to portray the Ripper on film. The problem with this one is, I don't know if Peter Ackroyd had some misinformation or what his exact source was, but there is a Jack character in the film Waxworks, but it's not Jack the Ripper, it's Spring-Heeled Jack. And even looking at the photo that he provides in the book Jack the Ripper in the East End, that character is very clearly noted as Spring-Heeled Jack, although the film Waxworks was originally made in Austria. It is a German film, but because it's a silent film, they have cards that they play in between the scenes. And actually, the German version with the German cards and texts no longer exists. The film does exist in English, French, and Czech, though. I, of course, watched the English language version. And this depiction of Jack the Ripper, this depiction of Spring-Heeled Jack, I should say, is really quite different than what Spring-Heeled Jack is, because Spring-Heeled Jack is sometimes depicted as a man who can jump very high, who can jump over 9 feet walls effortlessly, and sometimes he's depicted as some type of paranormal figure, like a devil with wings. None of that stuff was present in the film Waxworks. Very clearly, he looks like Jack the Ripper, and it seemed like they were creating a character that was based on Jack the Ripper and not Spring-Heeled Jack, but very clearly the character was labeled as Spring-Heeled Jack. So, I mean, you can take that for what you will. I don't know if that would count as the first depiction of Jack the Ripper on film. Waxworks from 1924. It's a very, very interesting movie. For people who love silent movies like me, I absolutely found the whole thing entertaining. It was divided mostly into three parts. One of them told the story of the Caliph of Baghdad, one of Ivan the Terrible from Russia, and the third story, which was the shortest, unfortunately, was the story of Spring-Heeled Jack. And there is a wax museum exhibit where they hire a writer to compose horror stories about these three characters, the Caliph of Baghdad, Ivan the Terrible, and Spring-Heeled Jack. But there again, I mean, really the character seems to be acting like Jack the Ripper. Although, I will say that there was some excellent visual imagery for the time. I know the film has been remastered, but I've watched a lot of silent films in the past. It reminded me of a film called The Conquering Power from 1921 with Rudolph Valentino. And even certain elements of Waxworks reminded me of The Lodger, which came later in 1927. But anyway, I would like to turn it over to you guys now and just simply ask, what do you think about the description of the killer? What do you think about the height and weight estimates? What do you think about these descriptions of Jack the Ripper with the beard and mustache? Do you think that they're accurate? What do you think about that statement from John Douglas that he was talking about how there was this sad, lonely man between the ages of 25 and 35 who would be perceived as odd by other people, no friends, no father growing up? What do you think about those observations? What do you think about any of the suspects mentioned? And I really want to know what you guys think about Leather Apron, John Pizer. Do you believe that there's going to be any credit and any viability to this theory that Leather Apron's alibi might not be accurate? And if you have any comments about the other suspects, whether it's Aaron Kosminski, Montague John Druitt, or George Chapman, please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Let me know if you would like to hear something more about Stephen Knight and the Final Solution. And you might be wondering, why wasn't I talking about some of the other suspects on this list of suspicious characters? Well, very simply, the ones that you're probably curious about were not mentioned. Charles Lechmere was not mentioned, as well as Hyam Hyams. He's another suspect that has come up in recent times. It appears that this book, Jack the Ripper in the East End, was written before they were widely publicized. But the writings that you heard were from Peter Ackroyd, and Jack the Ripper in the East End is still available on Amazon.com, although, as I told you and as Paul Begg told you, this book heavily focuses on the East End, and there are only 2 sections about Jack the Ripper in it. But please let me know what you think about anything, and you can write the show at blackboxonlineradio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook name is Ned DeHaan. There's also an Instagram page, blackboxned88 on Instagram. And this show comes to you Monday through Friday, talking about the Zodiac Killer, the disappearance of Maura Murray, Ripper Wednesday, which you're listening to now, Dahlia Thursday, which is about the Black Dahlia murder, and Cooper Friday, about D.B. Cooper. I also release shorts and reels Monday through Friday here on Instagram, Facebook, and of course YouTube. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com. buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88, and that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. This show is available for free downloads on the podcast circuit under the names Black Box Podcast or Black Box True Crime, and you can get the images that you see going by on the screen available at True Crime Designs on Facebook. They are archived over there. And I will see you tomorrow for a new episode about the Black Dahlia. Until next time.